So welcome everybody. Really excited to be doing today's Basecamp session. This week we're going to be focusing on a policy report that America Succeeds actually just released recently. We're really missing EdVenture this year, and so Basecamp was our way of trying to bring EdVenture online a little bit, and we're excited to get to see you all and learn a little bit. If you joined us last week for the first one, you'll remember this, but a couple of notes for the run of show. We'll start with a 10-minute presentation. The authors of this year's report, Emily and Lauren, are going to lead that. Then we'll dive a little deeper into the conversation. We're really lucky to have Zahava Stadler from formerly of EdBuild and now with Education Trust join us to dive a little deeper on the school funding portion. And then we'll have 10 minutes at the end for the audience. If you have questions along the way that you want to make sure get asked, please don't hesitate to put them into the chat and we'll take care of it. We are recording this to make sure that we can send it out to folks who might have missed it. And let's see, it's the second session, so it's technically the second day of EdVenture. Make sure everything's set. Tim, do you have your red pants on?
I do have my red pants on.
Excellent, there we go. All right, well then we are ready to go. EdVenture second day can begin, so Basecamp session 2 can begin. So with that,
which means that Darrell is probably also wearing red pants wherever he is.
I like that. I will check in with him while we're doing this. Let's turn it over to Emily and Lauren to get started.
Well, thanks, Eric. So we spent much of the spring and summer of this year listening and learning. We attended countless webinars and read a ton of articles on every aspect of the pandemic in education. And we distilled from all that information 4 key policy areas for advocacy over the next year. And they are school finance, social emotional learning, teachers and leaders, and assessment and accountability. So after narrowing down to the 4 key policy areas, we contacted experts and thought leaders who work on these policies and posed a straightforward question. If you were to push for policy in 2021, what would your ideal state look like, and what would you prioritize and why? So our report, Bouncing Back Student-Centered Policy Priorities for 2021, shares what we learned. It's not intended to be a comprehensive list, and we recognize that there are many policy levers that need to be pulled, and that some states need help in certain areas more than others. But we believe these policy priorities are key to ensuring our schools, educators, and students bounce back from the current crisis and are more resilient and ready for the next one, which hopefully will not come anytime soon. So let's jump into the priorities. Our first priority is school finance, because schools need funding to support the students they serve. Fair and equitable funding is more important than ever, as COVID and economic downturn has threatened school budgets, and this strain is likely to last for the next couple of years. So in an ideal state, we want funding systems to become more equitable. And for that to happen, it helps to think about revenue and allocation separately. Funding systems need revenue sources that are as stable as possible and collected at the highest level possible. Our expert, Zahava Stadler, who Eric mentioned you'll hear from in a few minutes, recommended pooling property tax collection up to the state level, or at least a level higher than the school district, so that local revenue sources are pooled and distributed equitably across the state or county. States also need allocation systems that are adequate, equitable, responsible, and transparent. So allocation refers to the funding formula used by the state to distribute dollars. Ideally, a state will use a weighted student-based funding formula because it's the most equitable in terms of formula structures, and allows for the focus to be on students' individual needs. So with funding attached to students rather than programs or specific inputs, there's more room for flexibility and innovation.
Right. Next up, we are prioritizing social emotional, often referred to as SEL. For those who aren't familiar with the process of developing self-awareness and skills that are for
one question I have though is about the prior grant.
so it's developing competence, decision making, developing and maintaining relationships, empathy, self-management, and the list goes on. It's become a hot topic in education space the last few years because there are such positive benefits to having SEL standards in the classroom. And research has shown improvement in student achievement, behavior, economic mobility when SEL competencies are taught. And by developing those competencies I mentioned earlier, they're learning the skills needed to be successful in life and career, like communicating effectively, problem solving, teamwork, and being adaptable. So in an ideal state, we are prioritizing SEL in the wake of COVID because it can play such a significant role in helping students address and overcome the stress, trauma, and uncertainty of the pandemic and school closures. And as we look to address student and educator needs, the SEL expert we spoke to wants to challenge districts who don't already have SEL integrated that now is the perfect time to get standards in place. And our next priority is teachers and leaders. When COVID struck, teachers and school leaders were forced to rapidly respond to the disruption in teaching and learning. As our most important resource, teachers are our only chance of catching students up from the learning loss a majority of them have likely experienced. The role has shifted from being in person to likely teaching online for the first time across multiple platforms, and at the same time addressing the uncertainty of ongoing disruptions related to school and community outbreaks, and the understandable distraction of worrying about the disruption in their own lives. So in an ideal state, our experts highlighted that general flexibility around financial rules and teacher evaluation and increasing professional development will be present. Giving states leeway to redirect funds where they are most needed instead of holding them to the same financial rules as an ordinary school year will be important in ensuring the best outcomes for students. And while it's tempting for states to waive teacher evaluation requirements altogether, it's crucial that districts understand their workforce and their needs. Teachers will need regular feedback and observations as they are facing what is likely the most challenging aspect of their teaching careers. And lastly, stepping up on professional development opportunities to give teachers the extra training and supports they need to be successful during this time, like how to effectively teach online and be engaging across multiple platforms, will be critically important as they adapt to this new normal. And finally, we are prioritizing assessment. The interruption of the last school year meant over 56 million students in the US either converted entirely to remote learning or had their school year end early. With this, we lost spring summative assessments. So going into the school year, we are lacking baseline information on how much students learned this last year. Students already experience summer learning loss at a rate of 25 to 30%, with higher rates for Black and Hispanic students. So the sudden disruption is sure to result in learning losses that far surpass what is typical. In a recent study, McKinsey and Company found that Black, Hispanic, and low-income students are at a higher risk of not receiving remote instruction of average or above average quality. In fact, they predict these students could suffer nearly twice the learning loss of the average student. So in an ideal state, we know where students are at the beginning of the school year. Ideally, states have both common diagnostics and a statewide summative assessment in place so that parents, teachers, and students are all on the same page when it comes to academic readiness, social emotional well-being, and learning gains. Allowing states to offer multiple assessment windows and to identify additional data points to collect in order to have a fuller picture of student performance will allow us to not just meet students where they are, but to gauge what's actually working.
So that's it. Nothing groundbreaking, but when it comes to managing through disruption and change, tightening up on the fundamentals really presents the best chance for success. So get funding right, don't discount SEL, support teachers and leaders with meaningful feedback and development, and know where every student is and where they need to go academically and otherwise. So if advocates need a concise, targeted set of policies for 2021, we think these can help every student succeed.
Excellent. Thank you, Lauren and Emily. So we are very excited to be joined by Zahava Stadler. Zahava was formerly with the nonprofit EdBuild and is now with Education Trust. and Zahava joins us to dig a little deeper into the school finance piece. Zahava, how are you?
Doing well, thanks. It's good to join you guys.
Excellent. Good to have you here. Zahava, I want to start out with, we had a little chance to touch base before this, and so I want to start out with where you might be today. What would you change in terms of your recommendations if we were doing the interview today?
I don't know that I would unsay anything that I said. I stand by everything that's in the report, but I think that because when we originally spoke, we were much earlier on in the COVID crisis, and the budgetary impacts that states are experiencing were not being felt quite as sharply yet. And so I just want to differentiate a little bit between immediate advocacy needs and medium-term priorities. And by that I mean everything that's in the report, the discussion of funding pooling, making sure you think about your revenue sources, making sure that you structure your funding formula in the right way. Those are all really fundamental reforms that a lot of states need to pursue. And if an advocate showed up at the Capitol today and said, it's time for a funding formula overhaul, a lot of people would look at them and say, are you nuts? We've got a crisis going on. And on the one hand, no, this is not less important than it was before. In fact, it's more important, but you also have to be cognizant of the fact that you're walking into a conversation that's less about reform than it is about how much can we stand to cut. And this is really the tragic situation that a lot of advocates find themselves in, where as states see their revenue sources declining, and remember, nearly every state has a balanced budget requirement. They can't deficit spend like the federal government. The money has to come from somewhere. You either have to get new money or you have to cut it from your budget. That this is the reality that advocates are going to be facing in the State House, and they have to be thinking about cuts. So I think that first and foremost, I just want to lay out there something that we didn't discuss that wasn't in the report conversation, which is cuts defense is really important, trying to make sure that your state doesn't go to education first, but also recognize that in a lot of places cuts are coming, and if you don't engage with that, then cuts are going to happen without an equity-focused advocate at the table. And so making sure to be a part of that conversation, whether it's happening privately or publicly, and making sure to think in a serious and sophisticated way about how cuts can protect the students that can least afford a cut. So that's just a fancy way of saying, like, if you need money, don't get it from over here, get it from over there instead. So if you have an across the board cut for every student that's equal for everybody, then that equal cut is going to fall harder on students that have greater needs. If you're cutting an equal percentage of all districts, then that percentage cut is going to fall harder on districts that are more reliant on state help because they've got less at home. Being conscious of equitable practices, even as you're cutting, is really non-negotiable if you want to wind up in a place where communities are going to be able to bounce back in a future focused way. Once your state weathers that conversation, all of the fundamental reforms that we're talking about are still very much in play. And for anybody who says, you know, we just don't have the bandwidth to talk about funding right now, it's too bruising a fight, it's too big, it's too complicated, there's too much math, we need to be talking about things that are, you know, fill in your preferred priority here. This is really one of those situations where you cannot be too busy driving to stop for gas. Nothing is going to happen without the funding. And so you've got to do the right job on getting your funding in place if you want to do anything else that's on your list of priorities.
Wow, cuts defense and can't be too busy driving to stop for gas. Those really resonate. I like both of those. So tell me, if you're looking around the country right now, I assume we're still probably on the front end of this curve, but maybe some places have started. Have you seen any states you could point to that are already starting to do it right and give you hope? And are you seeing any states that are already sort of doing it wrong and you would point to and say, don't do it like them?
Well, I think one place that's had a promising equity focus as they've been doing the cuts conversation is Ohio, that the state government of Ohio has considered the local funding capacity and the community need, and just, what can this community bear when they dictated what cuts were going to happen on a district by district basis. And it's just important to find a way to do that. There are lots of different ways to do that. They don't all have to look the same. But that kind of consciousness is in place in the process that Ohio has started. Compare that to, a place like Georgia that's already seen huge, deep percentage cuts without that kind of cognizance. So we're looking at this in a lot of different ways, and more power to the places that are managing to avoid cuts. Some places came into this crisis with stronger financial footing. Maybe they're not going to have to look at deep cuts. If you were a place that already collected a lot of very stable revenue, maybe you were placed with a state property tax for education. That's a really powerful thing that you can lean on in a volatile time like this. But places that are really heavily dependent on revenue sources that are, all over the place. If you think about sales tax revenue and you think about the last time you were in a mall, that's going to tell you what's happening in states that are relying on sales tax revenue. To a slightly lesser degree, income taxes. The places that are leaning most heavily on taxes on the way life has changed the most, those are places that are going to see the steepest cuts.
Feel the pain. So allocation and revenue, you sort of presented that to us, and that resonated. Those two work together. But I imagine that they each have some different political ramifications. So is there, if you had to choose, which one would you fix first, or are there just different arguments that you would use depending on the state? How would you approach that?
There are definitely different arguments I would use depending on the state, but only because the status quo policy is different in different places. Where you start from really dictates where you need to end up to a degree, right? So, or I'll rephrase that. Where you start from dictates how much change you need in order to get to the right place. So there are some states that have a really great revenue policy, and they're asking the right amount of different communities. They're distributing it, with real cognizance of what the different communities can bear, and then their allocation formula stinks. And the result is really bad from an equity standpoint. So I would call out a state like Wyoming, where Wyoming has fantastic revenue policy and allocation policy that just isn't going to get them there. On the other hand, you might have a state like Indiana, where the allocation policy might care about all the good things, and you're providing important funding for low-income students, you're considering English language learner needs, you're appropriately adjusting for the things that students really need on your allocation side in terms of how we think about the money that should get handed out. But then the revenue policy is such a mess that you wind up with a totally inequitable picture. So you've got to get both right, because either one can totally undercut the other. And so where you get the money is important. How you hand the money out is important. And depending on where you are, you might need to really fix one or really fix the other. Or in some places, you might really need to fix both. But you cannot have good policy on one side and call it a day. And a lot of places where they say, oh, well, we're working on the funding formula this year, they mean the allocation side. They mean, how are we going to tally up what districts need? But if they're not taking on the revenue side, they're going to wind up in a mess. So that's just something that if I had to point towards one, I would say the revenue side, only because it's usually overlooked. But tell me what state you're in and I'll tell you where your problems are.
That's awesome. Well, that is a great segue, because we'll save this last 10 minutes here to open it up to our audience. Do we have questions folks would like to ask either Zahava or Emily and Lauren about the report?
Yeah, you mentioned states. Zahava, we're getting ready to look at Missouri's funding formula, which has a lot of issues in it, addressed both with allocation and revenue. I wanted to get your thoughts to see if you'd looked at Missouri.
So I have my state pet peeves. So I have like a little bit of a hobby horse in every state. So I would say the real thing that I would point to in Missouri on the allocation side, and I won't get too deep in the weeds here, but there's this thing called the performance threshold,
Yes.
for all of the important weights, that basically says, we think that English language learners need more support. We think that special education students need more support. We think that low-income students need more support, but not all of them. Only some of them, only if they're in certain districts. And if your district merely has the state average number of low-income students, then probably you're not going to get anything at all. Like, those kids have real needs. They have real needs whatever community they're in. And there is more to say on this from a wonk perspective, but fundamentally that is the place that I would go first. The other thing that I would say is just on the revenue side, Missouri's problem is that it's stuck in the past. Literally stuck in the past. Like, the property values that it considers are stuck in the 2004-2005 school year. And if you can handle the allocation side, but then you don't do anything on the revenue side, then there's places that can afford to contribute so much more, because property values have really gone up since 2005 in some places. And there are places that, you know, and because the state isn't thinking about that, because the state is putting on blinders to that change in circumstance, it's putting a bigger burden on the state to give money to places that don't really need it. And you know what they could be doing with that money? They could be funding the rest of the low-income students. So those are the two things that I would pick out in Missouri if, you know, if you gave me my pet peeves.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I actually just reread the formula last week, and those were my two. And balancing this notion of everyone keeps wanting to address and increase accountability on the system and the teachers and making sure students learn, which I understand. But in a situation with COVID, they're also looking at testing and performance-based testing, and some of the components that have been built into the Missouri system don't address those issues equitably. So it's interesting.
There's always more to do.
Always.
Would anyone else like to have their state palm read?
Me. I'd love to hear the same kind of overview for North Carolina, but I'm sure all of us would like that. We're all kind of standing in line, but fine.
North Carolina is such a funny situation because structurally there's a lot of mess on the back end, but it shakes out okay. So this is kind of the challenge with North Carolina, is that I have like a lot of bones to pick with the way the formula is structured. But at the end of the day, there's one extra grant that goes specifically for high poverty school districts that does such a good job that it covers a multitude of sins. And so if you were to look at the allocation side and see what the equity distribution looks like, it looks better than it should because of this one saving grace. I'll say the revenue side problem in North Carolina, basically, the state isn't trying to do a good job of figuring out what weight the community can bear locally. It's not really trying. So the state essentially funds the whole funding formula from the state and then says counties, which in North Carolina basically double as a school district for this purpose, counties have to shoulder the costs, all the costs of the physical plant by themselves. And that's everything from building a new building to just keeping the lights on. So what that does basically is it says, here are the costs the state's going to cover, irrespective of who you are and how much help you need. Here are the states you're going to cover, irrespective of who you are and how much help you need, moving on. So from a revenue side perspective, the state just isn't putting in that effort to really tailor support to the needs of those communities. So yeah, and this is something that as a national person, you know, like Brenda's saying in the chat that there's a history here. And as a national person, I don't always have the state specific context, but I can look at where we ended up and understand that there was something funky in the back end there, because this is not a normal way to do it.
Yeah, well, and your point, it's hard when you have something that's kind of working. I mean, our high poverty schools get $3,000 more than our low, affluent schools. But we want to make it better, but I'm afraid of making it better, throwing out the baby with bathwater, right? It's like messing with the parts that are working in order to make it better. That's the challenge in North Carolina.
Yeah, tough balancing act.
Yeah, Gary.
Ask, rather than Arkansas palm reading, do you have examples around the country of portability of local funds? We've found the portability for federal and state to some degree, but is it happening anywhere in regard to local?
There definitely are states where, as an example, charter students receive a per pupil share of the local funds raised in their home district, and they bring that with them to their charter. So I don't have an off the top of my head list of this, but EdBuild has a resource that I'll put in the chat where you can take a look at this particular issue and see which states have that as part of their charter policy. In those states, thinking about that as a model for applicability elsewhere.
Does it also apply to inter-district choice? Say if your resident district is not serving your needs, you choose to go to another. Do you know examples where you can take your local funding to an entirely new district?
This isn't something I've looked at systematically. I would say that the legislative language you're likely to see around the charter issue would be very, very similar to the legislative language you need to accomplish that with inter-district choice. So I personally wouldn't get too picky with where you're borrowing from, but certainly there are state models in that vein.
Thank you.
Any other questions? I've got another actually for Lauren and Emily. If we go back to the policy report, is there any policy in the report that sort of looking back, we've had a whole month now that it's been out, that you think is underemphasized or that you'd want to point people toward for more attention?
Want me to take this, Emily? Or you want it?
Go for it.
I think professional development probably. Teachers have a really, really tough job this year, and having more professional development options and supports in place to help them navigate the new teaching and learning environments would be incredibly helpful.
Makes sense. Great. Well, Zahava put in the link to the EdBuild archive. And we've also got a link up in the chat for the report if you want to read more about it. You can check out the blog and it links to the report itself. So we are right on time here. Zahava, thank you so much for joining us. Emily and Lauren, thank you. And to all of you, we'll see you next Tuesday, hopefully, for our next Basecamp session. It'll be our third one. We're going to be joined by EdMentum. They're going to talk to us about a new program they have called ExactPath, and a really exciting initiative they're working on in Oklahoma that might be of interest to you in your states. So thanks very much. Everybody have a great day.